The personal statement is one of the most important things on your medical school application because it gives the admission committee kind of a glimpse of you just beyond the numbers. However, I think knowing that just adds a lot of pressure because it's one very specific prompt, you have limited space, and it feels like it's like your one shot. Hi, my name is Cindy. I'm a fifth-year MD PhD student, and for the last couple of years, I've been creating content on social media, helping pre-meds navigate the application process, as well as share my real and unfiltered experience about what it's like being an MD PhD student. In my last video, we talked a little bit about what you're actually supposed to be writing in your personal statement, just breaking down that AMCAS prompt, as well as how to start brainstorming for it. In this video, we're going to talk about the natural next step, which is drafting. And I know I can't be there to hold your hand through every single word and getting it down on a piece of paper, but we will be breaking down kind of what's supposed to go into introduction, the body paragraphs, and the conclusion, as well as some of, I guess, misconceptions or potential mistakes you can make while drafting your personal statement. And disclaimer, as per usual, I'm a student and I hope my videos are helpful, but at the same time, I'm also just a girl on my internet talking about my experiences and offering my advice based on these experiences. It's impossible to cover every single possible situation. And so I always recommend to those watching my videos, take what's useful to you and leave the rest. And if something seems really, really off, talk to a trusted mentor that knows you, that knows your application. And so with all of that out of the way, let's begin. And as I was drafting this video, I was like, I actually didn't offer any advice on how to get your pen to paper or fingers to keyboard, whatever. Because in my opinion, that's just something you just have to do. You have to just sit down, force yourself, start a timer for like 15 minutes or something and try to get over that hump of just starting. You can try to wait for inspiration, you can try to wait for things to happen, but honestly, the easiest way is just force yourself to start, because once you start, you'll start getting some of that momentum and it will seem less scary once you actually have some words on the page. The kind of second piece of advice that I would have for you guys is just to get rid of the expectation that your first draft is going to be perfect. For most of us, and I mean like 99.9% of us, this first draft is not going to be perfect. It's not going to be something you submit. Your second draft probably won't be perfect either. Writing is such an iterative process, and I feel like the faster you're comfortable with that fact, the faster you're able to kind of get over that mental hump of how do I start writing. I used to do a lot of fiction writing, and in these creative writing spaces, there was a saying, along the lines of write drunk, edit sober, and I feel like it's kind of relevant here. Not that I'm advocating for you guys to write your personal statement while drunk, though I'm sure that would help with some of the inhibitions. What I'm trying to say is that when you're drafting and you're writing this for the first time, your only job is to get words on a page. Don't worry about the word count, don't worry about the content, just figure out what you're trying to say and get it down on paper, because you will have the opportunity to edit later. And editing, I feel like, is probably even more important than the drafting part, because you're gonna do some restructuring, you're gonna do rewriting, like there's time for all of that. So yeah, having that pressure that your first draft has to be perfect is actually gonna prevent you from doing it rather than, churn out a really stellar draft. So I recommend getting rid of that mindset entirely. And so with all of that out of the way, let's go into the introduction. In my opinion, the introduction has two purposes. One is to create a strong opening, something that people want to continue to read. I'm not calling a hook for a reason, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And number two is just kind of setting up the tone and the vibes for your whole personal statement. You're not trying to, tell the entire story here, you're just setting it up. One mistake that I've seen people make is dedicating way too much space to just the introduction. They try to give it all away in the first paragraph, essentially, but their first paragraph is also, half the word count. In that case, that's way too long. Obviously, it's going to vary depending on what you're actually saying, what story you're actually telling. But usually, introductions can be short and sweet, 3 or 4 sentences, and then you move on to the body paragraphs. And now there are a couple of ways you can structure the introduction, and the important thing is it has to fit well with the rest of your essay. And so here I'm just going to give you guys 3 different ideas or methods to structure your introduction, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, so there's some overlap between them too. The first approach to your introduction could be to kind of introduce the story chronologically. So this is going to work if your whole essay is going to be a chronological story, starting from the moment you decided you wanted to be a doctor, and then in each body paragraph kind of talking about different experiences that led you to applying to medical school. So in this case, the introduction might be the moment you realized you wanted to be a physician. It doesn't have to be a dramatic realization. It could just be a moment or an experience when you realized, hey, this is what I want to be doing. And then for the rest of the essay, like I said, you would talk about different experiences that nudged you towards medicine and eventually to applying to medical school. The second approach is to present a problem in the introduction. This will work best if your motivations for wanting to be a physician writing kind of comes from challenges or hardships. And then the way you would set this up is when you present the problem in the introduction and paint it as the reason why you want to be a physician, you then spend all the body paragraphs exploring that problem, how you approached it, and why that ultimately made you want to be a physician. The third approach, and this is the one that kind of can overlap with the first two, is to drop the reader in the middle of something. And I think this is like very commonly used because it is considered a hook. You could drop them in the middle of an experiment you're doing, maybe a shift as a paramedic, or any experience really that becomes relevant and important to your overarching story of why you want to be a physician. I think the key here is just that whatever you mention or decide to mention in the introduction should clearly connect to what you're going to talk about in the body paragraphs. And now let's take a moment here to talk about the hook, which I think is a misconception that people often have about how to write the personal statement. I don't really have a problem with the concept of a hook in and of itself because, you do want people to keep reading, especially because admissions committees are reading so many. However, I think where people go wrong is the idea that the hook has to be something really dramatic, really intense, and so interesting because it has to help you stand out. And I just don't really think that's the way to approach it. As I said in my last video about drafting, admissions committees simply read so many essays. So even if we think something is shocking to us, they might not think it's shocking because they've pretty much read it all. And so I think a lot of times when students go into writing the introduction with kind of the intention to shock the admissions committee through whatever story, it kind of tends to have the opposite effect, because what often ends up happening is students with the mindset of, oh, I want to shock my reader, is they'll take a relatively common healthcare experience and just inject a ton of adjectives and adverbs to it to make it seem shocking, but in reality, it's like a pretty common healthcare experience. So like, for example, you want to talk about a time where you're in a grocery store, you're an EMT, and then someone collapses in front of you unexpectedly. Now, this can absolutely be a hook and a great way to start your personal statement and explaining this experience led to me wanting to be a doctor. But the key here is that you don't need to go in and add dramatic details or embellishments because you feel the need to make it feel more intense for the reader, or you feel the need to shock the reader. In other words, you don't need to go into literary detail, describing the beads of sweat dripping down from your face, the room spinning as you did CPR. I think those are just really, really unnecessary because I feel like that kind of writing will come off as theatrical and contrived, and it will take away from what's actually meaningful about that experience. The takeaway here is just that, yes, a hook can be helpful, but you also want to really be careful of coming off as artificial or contrived, and I really wouldn't try to add more embellishment to try to shock someone. Of course, you can experiment with different openings, different ways of presenting an experience, but at the end of the day, your introduction just needs to be like a solid paragraph that clearly sets up the tone for the rest of your essay. So that's the introduction, and now let's talk a little bit more about the body paragraphs, which is where you're going to start building depth and answering the question of why you want to be a physician. There is a lot to talk about with the body paragraph, but I think the most important thing is you want to avoid the narrative resume. And what I mean by narrative resume is you don't want your body paragraphs to look like, you took your activity section, turned it into paragraphs, and then just slapped it into your personal statement and called it a day. And it's tempting because in middle school or high school, you were probably taught the 5-paragraph essay structure. And so it's easy to be like, oh, well, I've got 3 things that makes me want to be a doctor. It's research, it's shadowing, it's volunteering. I'm just going to throw that in and then call it a day. You don't want to do that. And I think this is like the most important takeaway of this video is that your essay cannot look like a narrative resume. If you take nothing else from this video, let it be this thing. The point of the personal statement is not, hey, admissions committee, I did these things. Like, you have a whole activity section for that. So let's talk a little bit about how to fix it. And by the way, I will be leaving a full kind of annotated version of my personal statement as well as like an earlier draft of what I mean by narrative resume, so you can kind of tell like how big of a difference it is when you have something that is like clearly just activities versus something with more of a narrative structure. I just want you guys to be able to see these fixes kind of in action so you can maybe see what I mean and also apply it to your own personal statements if you find yourself having a narrative resume. I do highly recommend kind of having drafted a version of your own before reading any of my materials, because I really want you to have your own individual voice and kind of a direction of where you want to go before being potentially influenced by resources or things you read on the internet. Okay, so fix number 1 to the narrative resume is to just focus on one experience. Like, for example, if you volunteered with a hospice organization and that was like a very, very central part to why you want to be a doctor, then that can be the experience you write about through the entire essay, and then each body paragraph will explore a different aspect of it. Maybe it's different patients you interact with, different moments that stood out to you, all of it contributing to why you want to be a physician. This approach makes you write several deep reflections about one single activity, and it is, I guess, by far the easiest way to avoid the narrative resume. Obviously, this is not going to work for everyone. This is more suitable for students who have one pivotal and standout experience that kind of is the backbone to why they want to be a doctor. And so if this is not you and you can't answer why medicine with a single activity, fix number 2 is to try to find the common thread between all of your activities. This is the approach I personally use because I did in fact include multiple experiences in my personal statement. And so the central question here that you need to ask yourself is, what is the thing connecting these experiences? And I don't mean adding some transition words and calling it a day. I like transition words, you need transition words, but it is not good enough if your transitions are just first, and then finally. That's not good enough. You need to make it very clear why these are the experiences that you chose to talk about in this super limited space. You need to make it clear like how these experiences connect to each other and also how they connect back to why you want to be a doctor. In other words, you need an overarching narrative. Reddit likes to call it a theme. For me, the word theme comes off as a little too literary, and I feel like it freaks people out when people say, oh, your personal statement has to have a theme. I also think sometimes when people say theme, they think too much like, oh, I need to force something to emerge from this. And that is like not the case. The experiences you talk about just has to make sense all together. So like in a very simple example, maybe you had 3 experiences. In the first experience, you were introduced to a problem that made you want to explore a career in medicine. In the second experience, you explored that problem again, but in a different way. And maybe the third experience further solidified and refined how you thought about the problem and made you want to be a doctor even more. And so kind of the theme or overarching narrative in this specific, very vague example is just the problem that you were considering or exposed to in the first experience. And that is your overarching narrative, is you considering that problem. So that's a little vague, a little abstract. I know I did have to try to figure something out to illustrate my point in the most generalized way possible. But with that out of the way, I'll give another example, a more specific one this time, kind of bringing in my own personal statement. So in my personal statement, I talked about 3 different experiences. First, my work with crisis text line. Second, my work with clinical research. And lastly, a little bit with shadowing. At first glance, these are totally distinct activities. They sound totally different, has so much potential to just be a narrative resume. And it was at one point, I did write a version of it that is a narrative resume. However, what I realized as I was working on this personal statement is that I can use this space to talk about different sides of me as I explored a career in medicine. So I've got this analytics side that's very grounded in statistics and research, and it's really something I enjoy doing. But I've also got this kind of more humanistic and more personal side of me rooted in patient interactions. So as I talked about each activity, I also connected it with each other and talked about how, both of these things, the analytic side as well as the humanistic side, informed how I thought about medicine and why I wanted to be a doctor. In other words, I really enjoyed what I was doing in research, but the data is always in the aggregate and it's very impersonal. But on the other hand, when I interact with people through crisis text line, or when I see my attending interact with his patients through shadowing, I realized this like more humanistic and patient-centered side brought me more perspective into what I was actually doing in research. And of course, I talked about how, both of these things are what I want to do. Like I ultimately want to be a physician scientist, though in this particular essay, I did not talk as much about the scientist portion because there's 2 whole other essays for the MD PhD applicants. And that could be a whole video in and of itself, like what the difference is between all of these. So let me know down in the comments if you're interested in seeing something like that. If this is still too vague, you can go down in the description and read the personal statement. And I will also, I believe, be having a video out soon, kind of dissecting it in video format and also critiquing it now that it's been about 5 years since I applied to medical school. If you do choose to read my personal statement, I hope you'll see that, I didn't just write, oh, I did research, I volunteered, I shadowed. And in fact, there's some common thread connecting all these experiences and how I thought about medicine and how all 3 experiences influenced the kind of physician I wanted to become. Now to close off, kind of talking about the body paragraphs, I want to talk about 2 kind of misconceptions/pitfalls. The first being showing and telling, and the second being writing about shadowing. Let's start with showing and telling. Getting the feedback of show versus tell really confused me when I was writing my personal statement. Because if you just Google showing versus telling, there will be web pages talking about how to better use your five senses, like how to write more vividly. And if you cannot tell from the earlier part when I was talking about the hook and the introduction, I'm just not so in love with the idea of writing a dramatic personal statement. Like, this is not fiction. And the things that you describe in your personal statement could very well be, somebody's worst day of their life, like depending on what you're describing. I just think this kind of language can, I guess, make you teeter on the edge of, potentially sensationalizing your experiences or like dramatizing experiences that don't need to be dramatized. And so when I read others' personal statements and I'm commenting show, don't tell, what I mean is actually something a lot simpler and has nothing to do with your five senses. It is actually just, I want you to tangibly illustrate your points instead of just telling me them. So as an example, let's say you have a sentence in your personal statement that's like, I was an approachable and understanding TA. Okay, there's nothing wrong with that sentence, but I am just supposed to take your word for it. And so in that case, if I read that sentence and that was a really central part to the personal statement, I might comment something like, hey, show, don't tell. And the way to show that you're an approachable and understanding TA would actually be to provide tangible examples of how you're approachable and how you're understanding. So you might start adding details like how you held extra office hours that were so well attended that you have to move to a different room. You spent time in the evening making silly props for your students so that I can understand a specific concept better. Or maybe you got a really nice email at the end of the course with a student telling you that you were the only reason that they passed the class. All these specific tangible actions that you said you did showed me that you were a good TA without you having to tell me that you were a good TA. Now, it's important to say that you can't and you also probably shouldn't turn every tell statement into a show statement because, as you saw in my example, the tell statement was like one sentence and the show statement was, a couple different examples. The show statements are always going to take more space. But if there's a quality you want to highlight or a lesson you really want to emphasize, that's the time to bring in the concrete examples, and that's the time to show and not tell. So for example, if you wanted to say that you really built a connection with the patient, I want to know why you know that and how. Like, did you spend a lot of time reading together, playing card games together? Did you get to know their family? I don't know. But if you just say, I built a connection with a patient, like, that doesn't do anything for me. I want you to show that you guys have this connection by showing me what you're doing in your interactions. And I want you to describe the process of how you guys got there. And I think show statements are one of the most effective ways to highlight yourself in your personal statement, your actions, your growth, what you took away from the experience, etc. And on the note of highlighting yourself in your personal statement, I want to take the last little bit of the body paragraphs portion to talk about whether or not you should talk about shadowing in your personal statement. I'll start this by saying that I did include shadowing in my personal statement. I mentioned it already in this video. I do kind of regret it. And so this is coming from, I guess, my own experiences and like my perspectives now, 5 years later, having gone through the process myself, having mentored people as well. And just to say that I don't think that talking about shadowing will break your personal statement. Like, obviously I got in, it worked out for me, but at the same time, I wouldn't approach it the same way if I were to write this personal statement again. In the annotated version of my personal statement and the video that I will have coming out soon, I'll talk a little bit more about why, if you're curious. But for now, I'll just say that I think it's okay to talk about shadowing as long as you don't dwell on it, and that is the key. And why I say that is because every single pre-med student applying to US medical schools have done shadowing. It is basically a requirement. Shadowing someone doesn't help you stand out. And the main character of the shadowing experience is actually the doctor you're shadowing. But the doctor you're shadowing already has their medical degree and they're not the one applying to medical school. And the personal statement really just needs to be about you, and the shadowing experience is very passive. If you really, really want to include shadowing in your personal statement, here are 3 questions to consider. Number 1, am I talking about shadowing just because I want to say that I did shadowing? If the answer is yes, you probably shouldn't be talking about shadowing in your personal statement because there's an opportunity to list it in your activity section. Number 2, does talking about shadowing help me illustrate an important point about me? Or does it help me build my personal statement narrative? If the answer is yes, maybe the shadowing experience does belong in your personal statement. But the follow-up question to that would be, is there another experience, one that is less passive, that would help me illustrate the same point better? If the answer is yes to that question, then you know what to do. Don't talk about shadowing, use that other experience that is less passive. If you do decide to talk about shadowing after all of that, what I would encourage you to do is not to dwell so much on what the physician is actually doing and instead bring it back to you. So for example, even if you're talking about shadowing, bring it back to what you learned, how it contributed to your understanding and knowledge of medicine, and also how it contributed to you deciding to pursue this path. And so that's all I have to say about the body paragraphs. And now let's move to the conclusion, which is hopefully quite short and sweet. Just like the introduction, I don't think the conclusion needs to be something completely mind-blowing. In fact, I actually think it's a little bit easier than the introduction because this is just a place to sum everything up. Obviously, the way you choose to end your essay will depend on how you structure the rest of your essay, but kind of two general ways you could do this is one, recap or reflect on a key lesson, then tie it back to why medicine. Or you could tie all of your experiences together and more explicitly tell the reader like what your overarching narrative is. Personally, I recapped all of my experiences and then wrote an explicit sentence about how those experiences contributed to the kind of physician I want to become. And if you watch my brainstorming video, this is actually directly from one of the brainstorming exercises. The conclusion should be pretty short and sweet. I wouldn't make it longer than maybe 4 or 5 sentences because you're not introducing anything new, you're just summing everything up. I will say conclusions are like one of the most satisfying things to read, but you do want to avoid introducing any new ideas in the conclusion. There was one time I was mentoring a student, and in the conclusion section, they had talked about how much they loved doing research and wanted to do more of that in the future, but nowhere in the introduction nor the body paragraphs did they talk about research at all. And so I remember being like, okay, we need to take that out, or we need to fit research in somewhere in the body. Like, the conclusion is not the place to introduce a new idea. So yeah, I don't have too much to say about the conclusion. Use it to reiterate your main idea, bring it back to why you want to be a doctor. And remember that just like a clear, focused conclusion is much better than a long one. Friends, we are now at the end of this video, and so I want to leave you guys with some post-drafting to do. Once again, the encouragement that this is an iterative process. It takes a long time. I started my first draft, I think, in December, and I submitted it like the first week when AMCAS was open. So that's how long it took me. Most of us spend weeks, if not months, to make it good, and you want to spend that time. Like, this is the time to spend the time. And so with editing, in the early stages, a lot of it is going to be self-editing. So give yourself the time to work on a draft, give it 3 or 4 days, come back and see what you like and don't like about it. Maybe something felt great in the moment you wrote it, but then 3 to 4 days later, you're kind of like, I'm not really feeling this. And that would be totally normal. And this is also the time where you can figure out if you're making common mistakes, like the narrative resume mistake, or talking about shadowing for too long, or maybe you're introducing a new idea in the conclusion. I'm gonna leave a link down below in the description with a personal statement checklist that you can go through as you're in these kind of self-editing processes. And then once you do feel ready to give your essay to others, I would recommend giving it to a few trusted people. Probably not more than 3 or 4 people, because once you get into the territory of 5 or 6, things start getting kind of stressful getting and compiling all the feedback, and they sometimes conflict with each other. So I would just choose, a couple trusted people. You can pick friends, but what I think is also valuable is just some outsider perspectives, some people who might not know you as well. For me personally, it was my school's writing center that offered these kind of essay edits for free. Other people to ask could be, upperclassmen who've gone through this process that you're friends with, research mentors, different faculty members. I personally don't think it's that weird to ask a research mentor if you have that kind of relationship. My personal research mentors went through my stuff, so they've been far removed from this process for a while and potentially have insights on what it's like to sit in an admissions committee. And so I was really grateful for that sort of feedback. And now you might be wondering, Cindy, what about paid essay editing services? There are tons of these application companies around. They charge anywhere from a couple $100s to upwards of thousands of dollars for like an application audit or essay editing, things like that. In general, on this channel, I've been a little bit more reserved to call them outright scams. However, I do have really mixed feelings about them because even though they generally provide what they advertise to provide, I don't really think their services are worth it. I think these kind of companies make an inequitable process even more inequitable. And I think there is a false narrative here that you have to be able to afford these services in order to do well in a medical school application cycle, which I don't think is the case at all. I also will just be transparent and say that I have worked for one of these companies before. And I will also just say that the amount I was making was nowhere near what they were charging the students. And I'm not necessarily saying that I should be paid more, but if they're charging students that amount of money, it's all going to, you know, administrators or whatever overhead that they have. All that is to say, very mixed feelings about these companies. I don't blame the students for using them, nor do I blame people who work for them. Obviously, I did in the past, and there are many reasons why people would work for them. Yeah, I don't know. There's so much to say about this topic. In all, my personal thoughts is that if you do want to use these services, that's fine. It will probably be helpful. Do I think it's necessarily worth the amount that they're charging you? Most importantly, I don't think you have to pay for one of these things to have a strong personal statement. On that hot take, I will leave it here. That's all I have to say about the topic. If you haven't already checked out my brainstorming video, you can check it out right here, as well as more pre-med resources on my blog and on this channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!